I don't think there's a louder silence than the kind you feel when you walk back into your childhood home after years away. The hallway smelled the same pine wood and faint vanilla, like time hadn't moved at all. But it had. 8 years, in fact. 8 years since I packed my life into the back of a used Honda, swearing I'd never come back except on my own terms. And now here I was, suitcase in hand, returning for my younger brother's wedding, and for reasons no one in that house could possibly imagine. I pulled into Charleston just after sunset, the streets glowing gold in that soft southern light. It should have felt like home, but it didn't. Not anymore. My name is Julia Carter, and for most of my life, my role in this family was clear. The reliable older sister, the one who kept the car running and the fridge stocked, but never quite got invited into the spotlight. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I'd built something better out in the world. But walking up those porch steps, I felt the old weight settle back on my shoulders. Inside, the house hummed with wedding week chaos, garment bags hanging on door frames, flowers scattered across countertops, the scent of champagne in the air. My stepmother Linda stood at the kitchen island in a cream silk blouse, swirling a glass of Chardonnay. She didn't hug me, she didn't even stand up. "Julia," she said, smiling that tight, polite smile. "You actually came. I hope the bus ride wasn't too bad." I had driven 7 hours in my own car, but I didn't bother correcting her. This was just the opening act. Because what no one at that table knew, not Linda, not my father, and certainly not my brother Ethan, was that tomorrow morning I'd be sitting across from him in a boardroom. Not as his sister, not as the girl they remembered with grease on her hands, but as the lead federal auditor for a $900 million corporate merger, the one he'd been bragging about for months. And by the time the meeting was over, the way my family saw me would never be the same. Coming home after years away is never just about the miles. It's about the history packed into every creak of the floorboards, every framed photo still hanging slightly crooked on the wall. For me, Charleston wasn't just a city. It was a mirror I'd been avoiding. The streets were beautiful, yes, oak trees draped in Spanish moss, pastel houses catching the late sun, but every corner held a memory, and not all of them were kind. Coming back meant stepping into a role I'd long outgrown, but that my family still kept ready for me like an old coat they refused to throw away. That's the thing about families, they're built on stories. Some are true, some are half true, and some are convenient fiction. Mine had decided long ago that I was the fixer, the one who could patch a flat tire, wire, a light unclog, a drain. It didn't matter that I'd spent the last decade in boardrooms overseeing multi-million-dollar audits. They never updated my chapter in their book. And if you've ever been trapped in someone else's version of you, you know how heavy it feels, like you're playing a part you never auditioned for. But the curtain keeps going up anyway. The first evening back, I sat at the dinner table smiling through the small talk, watching how the spotlight always found my brother Ethan. He was the golden boy, polished, confident, fresh off another business win. The conversation flowed to his latest triumph, a massive corporate merger. My father leaned in pride, practically glowing off him. "At 30, running a deal like this, that's rare," he said. I nodded quietly. No one asked what I'd been doing. I wasn't surprised. People rarely ask questions when they think they already know the answer. It's easier to keep a story neat than to let it evolve. I've learned that sometimes the hardest part of coming home isn't facing what's changed, it's facing what hasn't. In that moment, I thought about a friend from college, Melissa, who'd gone back to her hometown after earning her PhD. At the grocery store, someone asked if she was still helping out at the ice cream shop. She laughed politely, but later she told me it stung. It wasn't about the job. It was about how little they'd bothered to see her now. The lesson: people's perceptions often lag behind your reality, and it's not your job to shrink yourself to fit their outdated view. As I sat there, the hum of conversation wrapping around me like background noise, I decided I wouldn't correct anyone that night. Let them hold on to their version of me for now. Because my truth was about to show itself soon enough. And when it did, it wouldn't be in the form of a speech or a plea for respect. It would be in the quiet authority of walking into a room where I held the pen that could rewrite more than just numbers. Which, as fate would have it, was exactly where the next morning would lead me. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the guest room that used to be mine. The wallpaper was still the same faded blue, dotted with tiny white flowers, like time had pressed pause. On the desk sat an old lamp I'd used to study by its base, still scratched from when I dropped it in high school. I opened my laptop half out of habit, and there it was, an email marked urgent. My heart picked up speed as I read the assignment. I'd been selected to lead the federal audit on a corporate merger worth nearly $1 billion. At first, I almost laughed. The irony was too perfect. This wasn't just any merger, it was the one Ethan had been bragging about all night, the deal he was running point on. The very next morning, I'd be sitting across from him, not as his sister, but as the lead federal investigator determining whether the deal passed compliance. It felt like the universe had handed me a stage I never asked for, but was more than ready to stand on. This wasn't about revenge. It was about showing up fully as who I'd become without apology. Moments like this remind me of something a mentor once told me. Sometimes the best way to change someone's mind is not with words, but with proof. In college, I had a classmate named Aaron, who struggled to be taken seriously by his professors because of his quiet demeanor. Then he aced the most difficult economics project in the class, breaking down a case study with such precision that even the toughest professor stood up and clapped. He didn't argue for respect. He earned it by letting his work speak. That's exactly what I intended to do. Still, I knew the morning would be delicate. Family dynamics don't vanish just because you're wearing a professional badge. People assume that professionalism automatically strips away personal history, but it doesn't. It just forces you to navigate it differently. I thought about the questions I'd have to ask, the documents I'd need to request, and how each one might land like a stone in still water. My goal wasn't to humiliate Ethan. It was to do my job thoroughly, the way I would with any other executive. If that process rattled him, it was because the truth tends to do that. As I closed the laptop, I glanced around the room one last time. The glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling as a teenager were still there, faint but visible. They reminded me of something I used to believe, that one day I'd leave and come back different. That night I realized I already had. Tomorrow wasn't just another workday. It was the moment I'd step into a boardroom and watch my family see me, truly see me for the first time in years. And that more than anything was worth waking up early for. The morning air in Charleston was cool, the kind that wakes you up before the coffee does. I dressed in my navy suit pressed to perfection and clipped my SEC badge to my briefcase. Driving to Norwin Systems, I kept the radio low, letting the hum of the road steady me. The company's glass building rose ahead, its steel letters catching the light like a challenge. I'd walked into dozens of boardrooms before, but this one was different. This wasn't just a job site, it was my brother's arena. And today I wasn't walking in as an observer. I was walking in as the one holding the rulebook. Inside, the receptionist's eyes flickered with recognition when I introduced myself. 15 minutes later, I was being led through sleek glass hallways, past cubicles where whispers followed my steps. And then there he was, Ethan, laughing with two executives in tailored suits. When he turned and saw me, the smile slid off his face like paint in the rain. "Julia," he said, his voice tighter than he meant it to be. "Morning," I replied, calm and steady. "We're scheduled for 9, right?" He nodded, still, trying to process. "You're the lead auditor." "Yes," I said, stepping past him into the conference room. That moment reminded me of a story a colleague once told me about auditing her own cousin's startup. She said the first 5 minutes were the hardest, not because of the paperwork, but because family history sits in the chair next to you. It whispers things in your ear: be nice, don't push too hard. But professionalism demands that you treat every client, every company exactly the same. The lesson: fairness doesn't bend for familiarity. If anything, it should be sharper when the lines blur, because that's when the temptation to compromise is strongest. As the meeting began, I introduced the scope of the audit, reviewing Q2 discretionary spending, vetting consultant contracts, and confirming compliance for all international accounts. My voice was steady, but inside I could feel the room's shifting energy. Some executives stole glances at Ethan. Others studied me like they were piecing together a new puzzle. When I asked for the spending reports, there was a pause long enough to be noticed. Linda, seated at the far end, finally said, "I manage access to those." Her tone was clipped. "Then I'll need them by today," I replied, making a note. The conversation moved forward, but the tension stayed. By the first break, I'd already flagged 3 questionable accounts. Nothing criminal yet, but enough to require answers. As the room emptied, Ethan stayed behind, closing the door. "Are you doing this to embarrass me?" he asked. I looked at him steady. "I'm doing my job. What you feel about it is yours to own." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. In that moment, I realized this day wasn't about confrontation. It was about clarity. And clarity has a way of making the next step unavoidable, which as I returned to my seat, I knew would come sooner than either of us expected. When the break ended, the atmosphere felt heavier. I could see it in the way people settled into their seats, slower, quieter. The next phase was deep document review, and that's where stories often start to change. Numbers don't lie, but they can be dressed up to look better than they are. My job was to strip away the decoration and see the truth underneath. It reminded me of sanding down an old piece of furniture. What you uncover isn't always pretty, but it's real. And in my world, the truth is worth more than a polished surface ever could be. I began with vendor contracts, cross-checking payment dates against service logs. 2 consultant fees stood out, large sums paid for vague deliverables, both with Ethan's approval signature. "Can you explain these?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He hesitated, then said he'd need to check. That's when I slid copies of the contracts toward him. "You signed them 2 weeks ago." His face tightened. Around the table, pens stopped moving. It's in those silences you can feel the shift, the moment people realize the meeting isn't routine anymore. That's when the real work, and sometimes the real resistance, begins. This is why thoroughness matters. A former colleague once told me about an audit where a single unexplained payment turned into a multi-million-dollar fraud case. The original amount, $12,000. Small enough to overlook until they followed the thread and found the entire sweater unraveling. The lesson details are the doorway to bigger truths. Most people think the big catches in my field come from dramatic discoveries. In reality, they're found in the quiet corners of a spreadsheet, where someone thought no one would bother to look. That's why I always look, especially when the stakes are personal. Linda slid a folder across the table. "This has everything you asked for," she said. I thanked her and began scanning. An offshore account labeled Miscellaneous International Services caught my attention. "This wasn't disclosed in your preliminary filings," I said. Linda's jaw tightened. "It's within compliance." "Then you won't mind if we verify," I replied, already making a note. These exchanges might seem small, but in corporate environments, every answer sets the tone. If leadership is defensive, staff takes their cues. If leadership is transparent, cooperation follows. This room was leaning toward the first, and it told me everything I needed to know about the days ahead. As the meeting wrapped for lunch, I stepped out into the hallway. The glass walls reflected back a version of me I barely recognized, steady, composed, unshaken. Years ago, I might have softened my questions to keep the peace. Not anymore. Today wasn't about keeping anyone comfortable. It was about keeping the process honest. And as I headed back toward my seat, I knew the next few hours would dig even deeper. Because once you start turning over stones, you have to be ready for whatever crawls out next. By the time the afternoon session began, the room had settled into a tense rhythm. Questions, answers, more questions, each one peeling back another layer. I asked about security contracts, operational expenses, and consulting fees. When the security budget came up, I noticed a large overage. "Ethan, I said you approved this yourself last month. Can you explain the variance?" His eyes darted to the CFO, who looked down at his notes. "I'll need to review the details," Ethan replied. "You signed it on the 14th, I said, sliding the form toward him. His signature stared back. The silence afterward felt heavier than words. Moments like that are why preparation matters. You don't ask a question unless you already know the answer. It's a principle I learned early in my career. Once during an audit at a mid-sized tech firm, I asked about a small office supplies expense. The executive dismissed it as trivial, but I'd already traced it to a personal vacation package. That discovery set off a chain reaction of findings. The lesson. In investigations, confidence comes from doing the work ahead of time. It's not about catching someone off guard. It's about showing you've already followed the trail to its end. I could feel the room shifting again, the polite veneer wearing thin. Executives leaned back, crossed arms, exchanged glances. In corporate spaces, discomfort often signals that truth is brushing too close for comfort. I've learned to read those signs the way sailors read the wind. It doesn't mean stop, it means adjust your sails and keep going. A question asked too early can give someone time to cover their tracks. But a question asked at the right moment can land with the weight of inevitability. That's what I was aiming for now. Linda spoke up, her tone controlled but firm. Julia, some of these questions feel personal. I met her gaze evenly. They're procedural, and procedures don't change based on who's in the room. That's another thing about my line of work. Fairness isn't about treating everyone the same in theory. It's about applying the same standards in practice. People respect processes when they see they're not up for negotiation. It reminded me of a neighbor back home who was a referee for high school basketball. He told me the hardest calls weren't against strangers, they were against kids he'd watched grow up. But the whistle still had to blow. When the meeting adjourned for the day, Ethan stayed behind again. "You're making me look bad," he said quietly. "I'm asking questions that need answers," I replied. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. I knew this wasn't the final confrontation, it was just the first real crack in his armor. And as I walked out into the cooling Charleston air, I could feel the next step coming. The audit wasn't just uncovering numbers anymore, it was starting to unravel a story my family had believed for years. The next morning, the boardroom felt different. Not physically, the polished table still gleamed, the coffee machine still hissed in the corner, but the way people looked at me had changed. There was less curiosity now and more caution, like they'd realized I wasn't there to nod politely and take notes. The first agenda item was a review of updated financial disclosures from Norwin Systems. As I clicked through the presentation, I noticed small revisions, numbers, slightly adjusted terms clarified. Changes like that aren't unusual, but they always make me ask one question. Were they correcting a mistake, or were they trying to get ahead of me? I began with the offshore account from the day before. "Ethan," I said, "do you have anything to add regarding last year's operating expenses?" He shook his head. That was outside my purview. Without looking away, I slid a document toward him, the same approval form with his signature. Around the table, people shifted in their seats. It reminded me of something my first audit supervisor taught me in moments like this. The room stops watching the documents and starts watching the people. The expressions tell you as much as the numbers ever could. Public pressure changes dynamics instantly. I once observed an audit where a CEO denied knowing about a contract until the CFO pulled up an email with him copied on it. The change in the room was immediate. Confidence turned to calculation, and allies began to distance themselves. The lesson: when the truth lands in public, people start protecting themselves first. It's not malicious, it's survival. That's why timing matters. Bringing a key finding into the open isn't just about the evidence, it's about understanding the ripple it creates. Linda leaned forward, her voice smooth but sharper now. "Julia, you're putting the entire deal at risk with these questions." I met her gaze. "I'm doing my job. If the deal is solid, it will stand. If it's not, that's not because I asked the wrong questions, it's because someone gave the wrong answers." In corporate negotiations, this is the crossroads. Either transparency strengthens the project, or hidden flaws collapse it. Pretending there's a middle ground only delays the inevitable. It's a truth I've seen play out too many times to ignore. By the time we broke for lunch, I knew we were past the point of polite discomfort. This was now a test not just of compliance, but of resilience. Ethan avoided my eyes as he left the room, while a few board members lingered, watching me the way you watch a storm rolling in. I gathered my notes, feeling the weight of what came next. The numbers had spoken, but now the story was about to move beyond spreadsheets and into consequences. And that's where the real unraveling always begins. That afternoon, the tone in the building had shifted entirely. Conversations that once flowed openly now broke off when I walked by. People who'd greeted me with polite smiles the day before now avoided eye contact. This happens in corporate spaces when uncertainty sets in. Alliances start to wobble, and no one wants to be caught on the wrong side. I'd seen it before during a merger review in Chicago. One day the executive floor was all champagne and optimism. The next, it was closed doors and whispered hallway chats. The difference: one memo from compliance, questioning the accuracy of a single report. When we reconvened, the discussion turned to consultant payments. I highlighted 2 contracts with irregular terms, both linked back to Ethan's department. These were approved outside the standard bidding process, I noted. "Can you clarify why?" He glanced at Linda, who gave a small shake of her head. "It was time-sensitive," he said. "We didn't have time for the usual steps." That explanation might work in a casual conversation, but in regulated industries, process is the safety net. Skip it, and you're left hanging without protection when the questions start. And once the questions start, they rarely stop. The truth is, bypassing procedure isn't just a paperwork issue, it's a trust issue. Years ago, a friend worked at a construction firm where a project manager hired his cousin's company without bids. The job went over budget, and the cousin's work failed inspection. The fallout wasn't just financial, it damaged the firm's reputation with future clients. The lesson: shortcuts might save time in the moment, but they almost always cost more in the long run. In my role, it's my job to make sure those shortcuts get documented before they turn into full-blown detours. As I explained the potential regulatory implications, the mood in the room cooled even further. A board member from the acquiring company Axient leaned back and crossed her arms, eyes fixed on Ethan. "We'll need these fully documented before moving forward," she said. That's the kind of moment that changes a deal's momentum. You can feel it like the air pressure dropping before a storm. Suddenly, it wasn't just me asking for clarity. It was the partner company, and that carried its own weight. Ethan sat back silent, his jaw tight. When the meeting wrapped, I could tell the ripple effects were already moving beyond the boardroom. My phone buzzed with an email from an external legal team requesting a summary of my findings to date. That kind of request means people are preparing for impact. As I packed my notes, I thought about the next day's agenda. We were moving from preliminary review into formal recommendations, and that's when conversations stop being hypothetical. That's when numbers turn into decisions, and decisions turn into consequences. And for this merger, those consequences were about to land squarely in the family. By the next morning, the shift was undeniable. Ethan no longer carried himself with the easy confidence I'd seen on day one. He arrived early but lingered outside the boardroom, as if walking in would commit him to something he wasn't ready to face. Linda entered moments later, her usual crisp smile replaced by a tight, unreadable expression. Family history aside, I knew this look. It's the one people wear when they realize a decision is about to be made without them. In business as in life, the moment control starts to slip, so does the ability to predict the outcome. We opened with the consultant payments. Overnight, my team had pulled supplemental records, showing how the approvals bypassed both the bidding process and compliance checks. This isn't just procedural, I explained to the room. Skipping these steps creates exposure, financial, legal, and reputational. I've learned that in corporate environments, reputation can be harder to repair than balance sheets. Years ago, a retail chain I audited lost a merger opportunity because a minor oversight suggested deeper governance issues. The deal wasn't killed by the numbers, it was killed by doubt. And doubt, once introduced, spreads fast. Ethan tried to recover. "We were under pressure to meet deadlines," he said, leaning forward. "Sometimes you have to make calls in real time." I nodded slightly. "And those calls still need to be documented, especially at this scale. That's the heart of compliance. Documentation isn't bureaucracy for its own sake. It's a safeguard. It's proof of intent. Without it, everything becomes open to interpretation, and interpretation is where problems grow. The lesson here is simple: urgency doesn't excuse omission. It demands clarity. When the stakes are high, transparency isn't optional, it's the foundation." The offshore account was next. This time I asked directly who authorized its creation. Linda's answer was quick. "It's within compliance, as I said before." But this time, Axient's lead counsel leaned in. "Compliance isn't the same as transparency. We'll need the full trail dates, transfers, beneficiaries before we can proceed." That shift was significant. It wasn't just me asking anymore. The acquiring company was now publicly questioning their partner's integrity. In deal-making, once the buyer voices doubt, the balance of power changes. What had been framed as a partnership now felt more like an investigation. When the session ended, I stepped into the hallway, and for a brief moment, I let myself breathe. The professional in me knew we were doing exactly what needed to be done. The daughter, the sister, the stepdaughter in me felt the weight of what those findings meant for people I'd grown up with. But the truth doesn't bend for personal comfort, it only waits to be found. Tomorrow I'd deliver my preliminary recommendation, knowing it could shift the entire course of the merger and the story my family had been telling themselves for years. That evening, after the longest day of the audit so far, I returned to the guest room. I had barely taken off my jacket when there was a knock at the door. It was Ethan. His tie was loosened, his eyes tired. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped into the hallway, keeping my posture steady. "I'm not here as your sister right now," I reminded him. I know, he said quietly, but I can't ignore how much of this is hitting me personally. The words were raw, not defensive this time, more like someone finally realizing they'd been standing on thin ice. We moved to the kitchen where the hum of the refrigerator filled the pauses. Ethan leaned on the counter. I didn't realize how much I took for granted, he admitted. How easy it was for me to assume things would always go my way. I thought of a friend who once inherited a family business. For years, every decision she made was met with automatic approval until her first real mistake, and suddenly trust evaporated. The lesson: privilege can feel invisible when you have it, but painfully visible when it's gone. Losing it often changes a person's understanding of themselves. I told Ethan, it's not my job to protect you from the consequences of your choices. It's my job to make sure the process is fair. That's the core of integrity in any role. You can't play favorites, even when your heart wants to. Early in my career, I once let a client slide on a minor infraction because I liked working with them. That small favor backfired when the same issue came up later in a bigger, riskier way. The trust I'd tried to preserve ended up breaking faster than if I'd been honest from the start. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. Do you think I can fix this? He asked. I considered my answer carefully. You can try to make it right, I said, but not everything will be in your control now. What's in your control is whether you take responsibility. In the corporate world and in families, owning your mistakes can sometimes open more doors than pretending they never happened. People respect honesty even when the truth is messy. They remember who faced the storm instead of hiding from it. We sat in that quiet space for a few minutes before he stood to leave. Thanks for talking to me, he said. I don't expect you to go easy on me tomorrow. I gave a small smile. Good, you shouldn't. As he walked away, I knew the final day of the audit would be more than just a professional closeout. It would be a personal reckoning. Tomorrow the findings would be official, and the decisions that followed would shape more than just a deal. They'd redefine where we all stood when the dust finally settled. The final day arrived with a sky the color of steel, the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. I walked into the boardroom knowing exactly what needed to be said. My report was clear: procedural breaches, undocumented approvals, and an offshore account that required further investigation. I presented the findings without raising my voice, letting the evidence speak for itself. Around the table, some looked relieved, others resigned. Ethan didn't interrupt. Linda didn't argue. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about letting the truth stand on its own, even when it wasn't the truth people wanted to hear. When I closed my laptop, the room was still. For a moment, I remembered the first night back, the polite smiles, the assumptions about who I was. Over the past few days, that image had been replaced with something sharper, something real. The girl they remembered from years ago no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had worked quietly, relentlessly to be here. That's the thing about respect: you can't demand it. You build it piece by piece until it's too solid to be ignored or taken away. Later in the hallway, a board member from Acxiont caught up to me. You handled this with grace, she said. Most people would have made it personal. I smiled faintly. It was personal, I admitted, but the work came first. That's a lesson I'll carry everywhere when emotions run high. Anchor yourself in the principles that brought you to the table. Let the facts guide you. If you've done your work honestly, you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. The truth has its own volume. You just have to be steady enough to hold the mic. As I left the building for the last time, I felt lighter. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just clear. I hadn't come to rewrite my family's opinion of me. I'd come to do my job. And in doing so, I'd given myself the one thing I hadn't realized I needed: proof that I didn't need their validation to move forward. That's something I hope anyone listening remembers. You are not defined by who fails to see you. You're defined by the work you do and the integrity you keep when no one's clapping. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've had to earn your seat the hard way, I'd love to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that quiet strength can change everything. And if you want more stories of resilience, truth, and the moments that shift everything, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the next story might just be the one you've been waiting to hear.